With mandatory quarantine for fully vaccinated UK residents returning from amber list countries having come to an end from the 19th of July, and a day 2 post-return COVID test to remain compulsory, we're looking back at how effective the UK's mandatory 10-day quarantine was, whether there were loopholes travellers could exploit, the transparency of testing requirements, and the thinking behind the UK government's COVID policies. Joining me in the studio are Alex Georgiou, a bricklayer from Ilford, Walter Fibber, a spokesman for the UK government's Covid-19 task force, and Quentin Cash, CEO at a hedge fund in the City of London. Alex, let's start with you. I understand that you had to travel to Cyprus following a bereavement recently, but had difficulty funding the pre-arrival, pre-departure and post-arrival tests and making sense of quarantine requirements. That's right, Bob. I've got family in Cyprus and I had to go back because we lost a family member, and I had to get a pre-departure test, pre-return test, and day 2 and day 8 test, and then I had to go for an early release test. How much did that set you back? That cost me just over 400 quid. How easy was it for you to meet that cost? Not easy at all, Bob. I'm not exactly raking in money at the moment, and that's how much I normally spend just visiting family in Cyprus. Do you know what I mean? Just pay for my flight, bit of food, and that's it. They normally put us up, so that doubled the cost of my trip. I had to work double shifts for weeks to get that money together. And what about quarantine? I mean, that was ridiculous, quite frankly. I'm a bricklayer and I can't exactly lay bricks from home, can I? So I couldn't make any money. You're allowed to leave the house to post your COVID test kit, right? But what about taking the rubbish out when you live alone? Are you meant to just let it pile up for 10 days till your place smells like something's died in it? Walter, whether intended or not, is it not the case that the government's COVID travel policies effectively mean that the poor are unable to travel?
Quite, Bob. That's very much the idea. Think where the greatest concentrations of cases have been, generally in poorer sections of the population. So we're trying to stop the proletariat from taking us into a fourth wave. Quite sensible, if you ask me.
Hang on a second. So you're saying that the right to travel should be the exclusive preserve of the wealthy?
I may have been a bit too hasty in my response. I believe that we need to maintain prudence in order to contain the virus and avoid the spread of new variants.
That doesn't exactly address the question. Should the poor be allowed to travel? Yes or no?
I think there's a need for a measure of caution in the face of...
What about these exorbitant testing costs? £160 for a day 2 and day 8 test, when the wholesale cost of each test kit is around £3 to £4. The UK government's website directs people to a list of recognised COVID testing providers, carefully indicating that the government is not recommending one provider over another. There has been very little transparency around how these companies were selected. Studies show that the government has spent well over £10 billion during the pandemic on contracts without a competitive tender, and companies with links to the government have been shown to be 10 times more likely to be awarded them. Is this not corruption on a massive scale, leading to overinflated prices and shameless profiteering during a public health crisis?
Well, if you'd like to see real corruption, I suggest you would attempt to visit China, where even Chinese nationals visiting their home country from the UK are charged £300 per COVID test, and that's the cheapest available, due to the Chinese government's limited pre-selected group of testing providers in the UK.
But surely 2 wrongs don't make a right. What do you say to the allegation that the UK government is allowing corruption and conflicts of interest to influence COVID policy making? Quentin, you travelled to Spain on holiday and 4 days later to Italy for a friend's wedding, in breach of quarantine rules. Thank you for coming forward. Tell us about your experience on re-entry.
That's right. Well, I've been working for the best part of 9 months without a day off, and it was time. As to the wedding,
I can't really dictate when my friends get married. Re-entry was fairly straightforward. Immigration officers were checking passenger locator forms and passports before the electronic passport gates, and I would have expected them to pick up the fact that I'd been travelling during quarantine, but nothing of the sort. I mean, surely it would be fairly straightforward to have software in place that would identify the same passport number as having returned from an amber list country 4 days previously, but alas, they seem to have failed in that regard. In fact, I was treated to a smile and seemingly welcomed back into the country on my return from Italy. What happened next? I received calls on a daily basis from the government's coronavirus quarantine assurance team. I hardly ever picked up. They often called when I was on work calls, so they'd leave messages on my voicemail. When I eventually did pick up, a few days after my return, I was out for a walk, with plenty of street background noise, and they didn't seem too bothered about that. They just asked me a few simple scripted questions, and that was that. Walter, surely this makes a mockery of the quarantine policy? Final words in no more than 30 seconds from each of you. Let's start with you, Alex. Yeah, how much do I get paid for this again? Quentin. Sorry, where did you say the toilet was? Walter? I